The first sign that something had gone wrong was almost invisible. A single point on an ancestry plot had drifted away from where it was supposed to be. The grave was Viking. The burial rite was Viking. The objects placed beside the body were Viking. And yet, when the genome was compared against the reference populations, nothing fit cleanly. Not Norway, not Denmark, not Sweden, not any of the tidy northern categories that were supposed to anchor the dead. The nearest affinities were local, British, possibly older than that. The technicians repeated the extraction from another fragment of bone. The result moved slightly, but not enough. It was still wrong. And that was the problem. At first, it looked like a technical error, a bad read, contamination, a mislabeled fragment, something mundane. But the farther the analysts widened the comparison, the stranger it became, because the issue was no longer simply that the dead man came from the wrong place. It was that the categories themselves were beginning to loosen. That should have been impossible, or at least it should have felt impossible to anyone raised on the settled picture of the Viking past. For more than a century, the outline had seemed secure. The Vikings were Scandinavians who moved outward. Their ships, their speech, their art, their settlement patterns, their violence, even the geography of their expansion all appeared to radiate from a recognizable homeland in the north. There were arguments over motive, scale, chronology, and local variation, but much less argument over who they were. A Viking grave in Orkney or Ireland or northern England might belong to a raider, a settler, a trader, or a local ruler imitating foreign fashions. But when the burial rite was unmistakably Norse, most scholars assumed the body beneath it would, in some meaningful biological sense, be Norse as well. That assumption had deeper roots than archaeology liked to admit. In the 19th century, when nationalist histories were being assembled across Europe, the Viking became unusually useful. He could be turned into an ancestor, a racial emblem, a proof of northern vigor. Painters gave him fair hair and certainty. Museums arranged artifacts into a clean ancestral story. Language, blood, territory, and destiny were wrapped together until the wrapping disappeared. Even after serious scholarship moved beyond the crudest versions of that mythology, the habit remained. Scandinavian material culture suggested Scandinavian people. A sword implied a warrior. A furnished boat grave implied an incomer from across the sea, not because anyone was fabricating evidence, but because the evidence had long been asked to answer only one kind of question. Older methods seemed to support it anyway. Osteology could estimate sex, age, and general bodily form. Grave goods could suggest rank, role, and affiliation. Isotopes could sometimes indicate whether a person had grown up locally or elsewhere. Sagas and chronicles supplied remembered migrations, dynasties, raids, and political claims. Put together, the evidence produced a world that looked coherent. The broad directions of movement seemed clear. Norway pressed into the North Atlantic. Denmark pushed into England. Sweden looked east across the Baltic and along the river routes into what are now Russia and Ukraine. The Viking Age, in this view, was the outward action of distinct Scandinavian populations carrying themselves abroad. Then there was Orkney, low coasts, Atlantic weather, standing stones older than memory, settlement mounds layered with the refuse of many different lives. Long before the Norse took the islands into their political orbit, communities already lived there, farmed there, buried their dead there, and left behind a material world that modern archaeologists call Pictish, though even that label is later partial and not nearly as neat as it sounds. In places like Bersay and Buckwoy, excavators found evidence of a landscape passing through the difficult threshold between the late Iron Age and the Norse period. Scandinavian-style artifacts appeared in places with much deeper local histories. Burials were inserted into older settlement mounds. Cultural forms shifted, but not in a way that always looked like one population simply replacing another. So when a man was found buried in Bersay in a Scandinavian manner, the interpretation came easily. Here, it seemed, was the new order written into the earth, a Norse presence, a Viking identity made visible in death. For years, that was how such graves were understood. Historians knew that later Orkney would be drawn firmly into a Norse political sphere. Sagas remembered the islands that way. Place names shifted, language shifted, settlement forms changed. Even where archaeologists recognized continuity from pre-Viking communities, the furnished burials with Scandinavian forms appeared to mark the arrival of outsiders, or at least the establishment of a distinctly Norse elite. The underlying logic was simple and persuasive. Peoples leave things behind. If the things are Scandinavian, the people probably were too. Ancient DNA arrived as an attempt to move beyond that sort of probability. It did not begin with Vikings, it began with a technical misery that haunted the whole field. DNA degrades after death with astonishing efficiency. In old bone, most of what survives is not human at all, but microbial invasion, environmental contamination, and fragments so damaged they barely count as information. For years, researchers drilled into skeletons and recovered little more than noise. Then came a quieter breakthrough. The dense petrous bone surrounding the inner ear was shown to preserve endogenous human DNA far better than most other skeletal elements. Teeth could help as well. Under the right conditions, remains that had sat in museum drawers for decades could suddenly be read. The dead did not begin to speak exactly, but they became statistically legible. By 2020, that methodological revolution had reached the Viking world at full scale. An international team led from Copenhagen and Cambridge assembled ancient genomes from across northern Europe and the North Atlantic on a level no earlier generation could have attempted. More than 400 individuals were sampled from archaeological sites in Scandinavia, the British Isles, Greenland, the Baltic, Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Men, women, children, even infants, ship burials, settlement cemeteries, furnished graves, mass graves, isolated skeletons recovered years earlier and stored without any thought that they might one day become genomic evidence. The ambition was larger than simply tracing movement. It was to discover whether the Viking expansion had really been the outward surge of a coherent people, or whether the old picture had mistaken a cultural phenomenon for a biological one. The first results already strained the stereotype: Viking Age. Scandinavians did not look genetically like a sealed northern population carrying itself intact into foreign lands. There was substantial ancestry entering Scandinavia from elsewhere before and during the Viking Age, including from the British Irish Isles, the Eastern Baltic, and parts of southern and central Europe. Later work using finer statistical tools would sharpen that picture further, suggesting that many Viking Age individuals in southern Scandinavia carried ancestry linked to Central Europe that was not visible in earlier Iron Age Scandinavians. Even the chronology of Scandinavian ancestry abroad began to blur. A man buried in Roman York between the 2nd and 4th centuries turned out to carry a significant portion of ancestry related to early Iron Age Scandinavia. Centuries before the Viking Age is supposed to have brought Scandinavians into Britain in force. The North had been moving and being altered by movement for much longer than the traditional story allowed. But the most disruptive findings were not the broad flows on a map. They were the bodies that sat in the wrong graves. In Orkney, at sites long treated as straightforwardly Norse, the genomes refused to behave. One individual buried in Bersay in a Scandinavian fashion was found to be of Scottish ancestry. Other Orcadian individuals showed only partial Scandinavian ancestry, the kind of profile that suggests generations of mixing, inherited affiliation, or social adoption, rather than simple replacement. When the results were compared against both ancient and modern genetic datasets, some of these remains aligned more closely with populations from Britain and Ireland than with any Scandinavian grouping. In plainer language, men who had been buried as Vikings did not appear, genetically, to come from Viking homelands in the clean way scholars had assumed. This was the moment when the laboratory had to become suspicious of itself. Ancient DNA is never simply a revelation. It is also an exercise in controlled doubt. Researchers checked for contamination from modern handlers. They looked for the characteristic chemical damage patterns ancient DNA accumulates over time. They compared extracts from different skeletal elements. They asked whether 19th century excavation, labeling, or storage might have mixed bones from neighboring graves. They widened the reference panels and reran the ancestry models. The result held. The problem was not a laboratory accident, it was historical. If these men were local, then at least some local people had entered Viking society deeply enough to receive full Scandinavian-style burial. A sword and a burial form were no longer proof of where someone's ancestors came from. That still did not produce a clean replacement story. It created several competing ones. Perhaps these were local elites aligning themselves with newly dominant powers. Perhaps they were children or grandchildren of mixed unions whose ancestry no longer mapped neatly onto a single region. Perhaps some were dependents, captives, or enslaved people buried according to the customs of those who controlled them. Perhaps the reference populations were incomplete. Perhaps some lineages belonged to ancient groups that are still poorly sampled or not sampled at all. The unsettling part was not simply that the result contradicted expectation. It was that so many different explanations remained plausible once the contradiction appeared. And that caution became even more necessary as the anomalies multiplied. Some individuals buried in Scandinavia itself carried ancestry from the British Isles. Others in Norway were identified as Sami, even though their burial contexts had been read as comfortably Viking. The familiar fair-haired image weakened as pigmentation markers suggested darker hair was more common than popular imagery had allowed. At the same time, the new genomes showed that Scandinavia was not internally blended into one broad Viking people. Danish-like ancestry was especially associated with England. Norwegian-like ancestry dominated in Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. Swedish-like ancestry was strongest to the east across the Baltic. Inland and regional differences within Scandinavia remained strong enough that researchers could often tell broad origins apart. The Viking world, in other words, was simultaneously more mixed and more divided than the older story had permitted. One burial on the Estonian island of Saaremaa showed how difficult this made the vocabulary. Near the village of Salme, workmen uncovered 2 ship burials holding the remains of 41 men killed in battle around the 8th century, before the conventional opening of the Viking Age. Weapons lay stacked around them, arrowheads, gaming pieces, sacrificed animals. The debris of a failed expedition left in sand. Isotope analysis pointed towards central Sweden. DNA showed that 4 of the dead were brothers, with another close relative among them. This was not an anonymous horde. It was a kin group traveling together across the Baltic. Yet the wider dataset suggested that while some expeditions were intensely local, the larger world they belonged to was becoming increasingly porous. Families could sail out from one village, but the society that made such voyages possible was already drawing in ancestry, people, and practices from multiple directions. That is where some historians and archaeologists began to push back against the triumphal language that often surrounds genetic discovery. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it is not omniscient. It can reveal biological sex more reliably than older osteological guesses in some cases, though sex is not the same thing as social gender. It can identify close biological relationships, though kinship in lived societies is never reducible to genes alone. It can model ancestry, but ancestry does not automatically map onto language, law, status, or self-understanding. A genome can say something about where a person's forebears came from. It cannot tell us who that person believed themselves to be, what obligations bound them, what language they spoke in private, or how others situated them within the social world of the time. Other famous Viking burials made the same point from a different angle. At Birka in Sweden, a lavish grave filled with weapons and gaming pieces was, for more than a century, treated as the archetype of a high-ranking male warrior. Genomic analysis confirmed that the skeleton was biologically female. That overturned one assumption immediately and made another assumption harder to ignore. If the sex had been misread for that long, how many other interpretations had been resting on expectation rather than evidence? Yet the correction only went so far. The DNA could settle the sex of the buried individual. It could not settle the exact social meaning of the grave. Was she truly a warrior, a commander, a symbolic figure, or something else? Altogether, the genetic result was clear. The historical interpretation remained contested. The same tension shadows ancestry. If a grave looks Viking and the genome looks local, which piece of evidence is more truthful? Probably neither on its own. The burial records how the dead were placed in a social world. The DNA records deeper lines of descent. Those are not the same story, and sometimes they collide. In Orkney, later work on early medieval Scottish genomes made the problem sharper. High-quality ancient genomes from Pictish period Scotland showed that Orcadian Picts were genetically distinct from their mainland contemporaries, and that Orkney preserved substantial local continuity over roughly 2,000 years. That matters because it means the islands were never an empty stage waiting for Norse replacement. Local populations persisted. Some may have merged with incomers, some may have adapted without disappearing, some may have entered Norse institutions while still carrying overwhelmingly local ancestry. A Scandinavian-style grave in that context stops looking like a simple ethnic marker. It becomes evidence of entanglement. The burial might record alliance, aspiration, coercion, intermarriage, adoption, or political change enacted through ritual. The bone beneath it does not erase those possibilities, it multiplies them. The limits of the science run deeper still. Many groups in Northern and Central Europe during the first millennium were genetically similar enough that older analytical methods struggled to distinguish them with confidence. Newer methods have improved the resolution, but their very success has exposed how provisional earlier labels could be. Researchers also remain trapped by what survives. Across much of Scandinavia, cremation was common for large stretches of this period, which means a vast proportion of the Viking dead cannot be sampled at all. The genomic record is therefore skewed towards the inhumed, the unusually preserved, and the archaeologically recoverable. It is not the Viking world entire. It is the fraction of it that avoided fire, acid soils, erosion, disturbance, and oblivion. For that reason, the most careful geneticists have become more restrained, not less. They now warn quite openly that biological ancestry does not necessarily reflect group identity, and that biological relatedness does not necessarily tell us what kinship meant in a given society. That is an inconvenient message because certainty is easier to package. A colored ancestry plot feels final, a percentage feels exact, but the past rarely arranges itself around the labels we prefer. Change the sample, expand the database, introduce a more sensitive method. Suddenly, yesterday's confidence can begin to dissolve. What had looked like a fixed people becomes a moving frontier of affiliations. What had looked like an ethnic boundary becomes a blur of intermarriage, imitation, and local persistence. So what, in the end, did ancient DNA prove about the Vikings? Not that the old scholarship was worthless. Not that Scandinavians were absent from the expansion. They clearly were not. There really were movements out of what are now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden into the North Atlantic, England, and the Eastern Baltic. There really were Viking raiding parties with close regional ties and even close family ties. There really were Scandinavian migrants who left descendants across Europe. What the genetics undercut was the gentler but more powerful assumption that Viking identity was a biological essence carried intact out of a fixed northern homeland. That simpler picture is no longer compatible with the evidence. The emerging picture is less comfortable and therefore probably closer to the truth. Scandinavia itself was changing before the Viking Age reached its height. People were moving north into it as well as out of it. Some communities abroad absorbed Scandinavian ancestry. Some local people seem to have entered Viking society without needing that ancestry at all. Some graves signal affiliation rather than origin. Some origins predate the identities later built upon them. The old boundary between invader and local, Norse and non-Norse, settler and assimilated subject turns out to have been far less stable than the museum version suggested. That is a smaller conclusion than many people want, and also a larger one. Smaller because DNA does not hand us the inner life of the past. It cannot tell us what language a man in Bursay spoke as a child, whether he worshipped Norse gods or local ones, whether he had a Norwegian patron and Scottish grandparents, or whether the sword laid beside him marked honor, dependence, aspiration, or grief. Larger because it reaches beyond the Viking Age. It suggests that many historical peoples we speak of as though they were stable and bounded may not have been stable or bounded at all. They may instead have been temporary alignments of culture, migration, power, and memory, convincing while they lasted and misleading once turned into ancestry myths. And that may be the most unsettling part of the whole discovery. Not that one or two skeletons were misidentified, not even that the blonde northern warrior was in large measure a later invention. It is that we were asking the graves for one kind of answer when they had been holding several at once. In the older picture, the Viking world spread across Europe like a people carrying itself outward. In the newer one, it looks more like a shifting network of trade, warfare, kinship, settlement, and prestige, drawing in individuals whose ancestry could not be read from the objects they were buried with. Some came from Scandinavia, some did not. Some had local ancestors on the very islands and coasts later narratives treat only as targets. On Orkney, the wind still moves over mounds that were old before the Norse arrived. Beneath one of them, a man was laid to rest in a Scandinavian way, in a landscape with a much deeper local past. For a long time, that burial looked like a clean signature of invasion. Then the bones were opened, and the certainty thinned. The genome pointed inward towards an older island story. The grave pointed outward towards the Viking world. Both remain in the earth together. And between them, where the old picture used to stand, there is now something narrower, more complicated, and harder to name.